This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
The Bible is often dismissed as a book of myths, legends, fairy tales, and even propaganda. However, we often say on the show that when you examine the archaeological evidence, the Bible is actually shown to be pretty accurate. If you were ever wanting to see a long list of artifacts and evidence that affirms the accuracy of Scripture all in one organized place, then that's good because we've got one that we're going to be talking about. It's a book that came out a couple years ago, and it's called Unearthing the Bible, 101 Archaeological Discoveries That Bring the Bible to Life. And Henry got a chance to talk with the author, Dr. Titus Kennedy, about a number of the interesting finds listed in the book. Dr. Kennedy's a field archaeologist and has been involved in excavations and surveys at several archaeological sites, including the Khirbet et Tel excavations and the Jerusalem Mount Zion excavations. Here's Henry.
Titus, welcome to Digging for Truth.
Thanks, Henry. It's great to be here.
Hey, it's great to have you on the show. Please tell us a little bit, you have a PhD in archaeology now. Tell us what got you interested in archaeology and what spurred your interest in its relationship to the Bible?
Right. When I was in elementary school, history was probably my favorite subject. I like sciences, I like languages too, but I was really enthralled with history and ancient history. Of course, I knew that connected to the Bible somehow. But it wasn't until fourth grade when my teacher gave me a book on Heinrich Schliemann and the excavation of Troy. That was my introduction to archaeology. Before that, I really didn't know where all that information came from other than ancient historical records, books that had been passed down. And then I read that and I saw, there are actually people who go out there, find these ancient cities, they dig them up, they uncover these artifacts and buildings, and then they're able to add that material, that knowledge into the historical narrative. So I thought that was just really cool and incredible that people were literally finding pieces of the past that had been preserved for hundreds or thousands of years. And then as I was reading more and more, I saw how archaeology actually connected to the Bible too, because so many things had been discovered that showed the Bible's narrative to be historically accurate or just helped us understand that ancient world. And as I continued in my studies, I decided at the very end of high school that I wanted to try to study archaeology and see where that would go. So I ended up going all the way through PhD now.
Well, that's tremendous. It's a great story. We on our digs in Israel and at Shiloh now we're digging, we meet a lot of people. I always wanted to be an archaeologist, but I ended up being, an engineer or, a manager in a retail store or something, but at least I get to come on a dig. But you got to fulfill the dream a little bit further along than most of us.
Right. Yeah, I hear that same line a lot when I tell people what I do. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an archaeologist. And I wonder, are they inferring that maybe I never grew up?
Well, that's got to be part of it. It's a sense of adventure. I mean, we don't want to lose that. That's part of our experience in this life, and you certainly get to experience that. So we're going to bridge now over to your book. That's a little bit of your backstory, but you mentioned about the reliability of the Bible, and so this book we're going to be talking about, Unearthing the Bible. What were some of the motivating reasons why you wrote the book?
I had wanted to write some kind of biblical archaeology book for a while, but I wasn't exactly sure which perspective, which approach that I should take. Of course, there are a lot of different time periods that could be focused on. There are different ways that we could look at the text, artifacts, sites, historical narrative, etc. But I really enjoyed going to museums and looking at artifacts, doing research on them, photographing them, and I thought, this is really useful also for writing articles or putting together presentations and teaching. So I built up an archive of these artifacts, and I said, I could do something with this. I could put together a book that is about artifacts that connect to the Bible. And so I decided that would probably be my first attempt. and I wrote a book proposal and I sent it to a couple of publishers, and it ended up working out.
Yeah, it's excellent. So here I have a copy of it, Unearthing the Bible. Okay, 101 discoveries. It's very easy to read. Each artifact, you take up maybe 1 or 2 pages in discussion. You give a very concise overview of the discovery and how it relates to the Bible. It's not intended to be a devotional, but it almost could be used a little bit that way because you always give a Bible verse at the end of each discovery.
Right. I wanted people to see how what I was just describing with the artifact connected to the Bible. And of course, at the beginning of each entry, I have all the different references that would connect to it. But at the end of the text, I wanted to have a quotation from the scriptures so that people could see right through as they're reading what is one quick verse, what is one short passage that connects to this discovery.
Yeah, I like the way you set it out in that kind of pattern. I think even a high school student could go through this. Now, some of the discoveries, might take a little time for them to unpack. You talk about a discovery, and then you'll talk about a couple subsets of other discoveries connected to it. So you really talk about more than 101. But I like the way you did that.
Right. There are some entries, probably the majority of them, where it just focuses on one artifact. But there are a few where I thought that I really needed to mention some other artifacts that were very closely or directly related. And yet there was only limited space in the book, and we had a specific number. So there were a few cases where I would sneak in a couple more artifacts.
Yeah, that's great. So tell us about this Sumerian discovery about the creation of man.
So Adapa is a little known story that is set after the creation of man, but this person is depicted as sort of the model or prototype man. Some might argue he's the first man, but we know that he at least is depicted as sort of the prototype. And Adapa has a very interesting story because it talks about how he interacts with God or gods, and they give him this test, and it involves eating and drinking and eternal life, and he's in the realm of the gods. And so reading that, the original translators and people studying that, they made an immediate connection to, this sounds a bit like the Adam and Eve story in the garden and
Yes.
the test with the tree. So the earliest text that we have recovered that has this story comes from Amarna in Egypt from about the 14th century BC. But we know that it was composed earlier. And in fact, there were some texts talking about Adapa from Nippur, also in Mesopotamia, from about 1800 BC. And they talk about him as the first of the pre-flood sages. Okay, so it's set in this pre-flood period, and he seems to be the first of these great wise men back in that time period. And the story, of course, was written down quite early. We don't know, maybe it was even earlier than 1800 BC, passed down, we're not sure, but it does have some antiquity. But as we get into the story itself, that's where some more details get very interesting. Now, the name itself, Adapa, some scholars actually suggested that this is linguistically similar enough to Adam that they could be connected to the same root word. And that was one thing people were looking at. But then you look at what he experiences, and he is tested by the gods, and they send him to a place in the realm of the gods where he is told, oh, you can eat this food or drink this drink. And the gods essentially try to trick him. He is convinced to not eat the food of the gods because he thinks that it'll kill him. But then when they send him back to earth, he is actually told that had he eaten it, he would have been given eternal life. So it's a bit of a reversal of what we read in the story of Adam and Eve in the garden with the tree.
That's really fascinating. So we might say it's a remnant of the original story, and then it's been sort of distorted and perverted, but there's elements that have been kept. If I have this right from your book, there's some kind of penalty or disease, or disease as a penalty that's brought upon, is it him and his descendants, Titus?
Yes, it is. It's on humanity.
Okay, so when you say he's an archetypal man, he's a head, he's a representative head, and that's Adam. That's Adam in Romans 5.
Yeah, it seems very, very similar. And like you said, it appears as if there were remnants of the story passed on and they were modified, probably modified to fit a particular theological viewpoint, because we have gods like Enki and Enlil talked in here. And this is a pattern that we see throughout ancient Mesopotamian texts, is that there are quite a few major stories we also find in the Bible, but they're changed. They're a little bit different, and they adapt to the gods to which they are endorsing or writing about in Mesopotamia.
Yeah, almost a garbling of the original story. Now, how that was passed down, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly, but it gives us it looks, there's definitely a connection here somehow. Now, let's shift to another discovery that you bring out, another Sumerian story about 2000 BC, Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada. Why don't you talk about that a little bit, because this is another fascinating one.
Yeah, this is one of my favorites. It's a little bit crazy and out there for some people, maybe, but I think this is one that might connect to the Tower of Babel story. So Enmerkar was an ancient Sumerian king, actually one of the earliest that we know of. He appears on these very, very early king lists. We also have some artifacts associated with him, so it seems like he was actually a real person that we have evidence of, not just a mythological character. And in this story, they're trying to build a huge ziggurat for one of the gods. Also, by the way, he's king of Uruk, which is a city also mentioned in the early parts of Genesis, as usually translated in English as Erech. So they're building this big tower, this big ziggurat. Okay, Tower of Babel also was a huge tower, ziggurat, and it's actually never finished in the story. And then in a couple segments in the story, it talks about language. So in one place, it talks about how the language of humans is going to be changed, or the speech in their mouth is going to be changed so that they can all speak in one language again. So we see, sort of like in the Adapa myth, there is a remnant of the story that we also have in Genesis, and yet there's a bit of a reversal here. So instead of breaking the one language into many, it is consolidating them all into one so they can all communicate again.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Now, Erech, or Uruk is the way it's pronounced for the archaeological site, but in the biblical text, you're talking about Genesis 10:10, I believe, is correct. This points to a very early witness. I mean, the common theory is that Genesis was written after the exile, or much of it was written much later, but here we have a witness to what's often considered the first city.
Yeah, exactly. And that's very important to show that the author of Genesis, Moses, in my opinion, was familiar with this very, very ancient world and had correct knowledge about it, that Uruk would have been around at that time. Now, the other little interesting thing about this story and a possible connection to the Tower of Babel is that in Eridu, which is often considered the first city in civilization, there is a massive unfinished ziggurat, and some scholars have actually suggested connecting Eridu to Babel.
Yes. Yeah, that is, I've heard of that, and I misspoke when I said Uruk was the first city. It's Eridu, and that massive temple complex that's left there. Very interesting stuff, early chapters of Genesis. But let's shift now to Jacob and his family. There have been what are called scarabs, and I'd like you to explain what a scarab is. We've talked about them before, but for new audience members, that are very interesting, related to the patriarch Jacob.
Sure. So scarabs were used in ancient Egypt, and this is an artifact, or back then it was sort of a talisman or a piece of jewelry, but it was made in the shape of a scarab beetle, and the bottom side, sort of the belly side of the scarab, would be flat, and these were carved out of stone, or they were made from ceramic or faience. And oftentimes on this flat side, instead of leaving it blank, there were inscriptions. And in fact, one of the more common types of scarabs has an inscription naming the king or the pharaoh who was ruling at the time that it was issued. Many times these scarabs were part of a ring, so you could wear the beetle's back would be sort of exposed, and then you could turn it and have the inscription side out and then stamp in clay, sort of like later wax seals. So this could be an official ring used for the king and his administration. So that's basically what scarabs were.
So these ones that you're mentioning in your book, 27 of them mention Jacob the patriarch. Why don't you talk about that a little bit? Because, I'm sorry, it mentions the name, which could be connected to Jacob the patriarch. I stand corrected.
Right. These are sometimes called the Jacob hair or Jacob L scarabs because they all have that phrase or that name on them in hieroglyphs. So as I said before, a common type of scarab has the name of a king or pharaoh on it. But there are also many scarabs that have the names of officials or some other important person rendered on them. And that seems to be the case here. So we have this name, Jacob or Jacob. And so far we know it from 27 different scarab seals. These date to the Middle Bronze Age and approximately 1800 to 1600 BC. They've been found in Egypt, some in Canaan also. And so we see that there was a distribution throughout the land that Jacob and Joseph were in and familiar with in that same time period. Now, like you said, this doesn't mean that it was the patriarch Jacob in Genesis that this was made for, issued for. But it does show that his name was in use at that exact time in those places. And it's not a name that continued to be reused and recycled in later periods.
Yeah, so it fits the context, and with just a little bit of logical connection, it fits very nicely. Now we're going to move to the Papyrus Brooklyn. Now, so you have to explain what that is and what a papyrus is for our audience.
So papyrus is a plant in Egypt, and these were used to make a material sort of like paper. So think in ancient Egypt, this is what they were going to use for their paper. They would lay the reeds over each other and compress it, let it dry, and then it could be written on. Especially one side was much easier to write on in ink. So Papyrus Brooklyn was discovered probably in the Thebes area. It popped up on the antiquities market. So we're thinking southern Egypt, the capital of southern Egypt there. And it was a rather mundane list if you just look at the basics of it. It just names the names of servants in a household, giving their original name and then giving their new Egyptian name. But that's actually the first thing about this papyrus that's very interesting, is because it gives all these names, many of which are Semitic. Semitic is a language family to which Hebrew belongs. So they had their original name, and then they were given this new Egyptian name. If you recall in the Joseph story, the same thing happens to him. He has his name, Joseph, and then he is given this new Egyptian name, which scholars debate over exactly what that is and what that means.
Right.
But even more interesting is if we look into each of the names on the list. So many of these, as I said, are Semitic names, but several of them are actually biblical Hebrew names that we have in the Bible that are people who are Israelites or Hebrews, or a feminine version of male names that we have. One of the most obvious is the name Shiphrah. That's found on the list as one of the servants. And Shiphrah is one of the Hebrew midwives that's mentioned in the early part of Exodus. So we have a papyrus with probably 9 Hebrew names on it that dates to about the 17th century BC. So this pre-Exodus period, end of the time of Joseph, that shows that Hebrews or Israelites are actually present in Egypt before the Exodus.
Yeah, it's tremendous. And the other ones that you mentioned, just a couple, is Asherah, which is a feminine version of Asher, Genesis 30:13, and even a version of the word Hebrew, Genesis 39:14. So what you're saying, Titus, based on this evidence, and we have a lot more to fit this, and we have other episodes of Digging for Truth where we talk about this, is the Bible says that there were Hebrews living in Egypt during the sojourn, and we find evidence from a papyrus that that's exactly the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really compelling evidence.
Yeah, I think so too. We want to talk a little bit more about Egypt because it's obviously of such prime importance in the Old Testament narrative. Talk a little bit about a discovery related to the Pharaoh hardening his heart.
This is one of the more interesting cases of how archaeology illuminates what could be a confusing passage in the Old Testament. So if you read through that narrative, we see Pharaoh hardens his heart, and then we see God hardens Pharaoh's heart, right? But if you look into the Hebrew of that, you see that there's actually two different words that are being used for harden. One is to make heavy, and the other is to strengthen. And so what's going on there? Well, if we look at the ancient Egyptian context of this, it gives us some insight into what was being said and also how Moses is communicating something important, very important principle. In the Egyptian realm of theology and the afterlife, they had this process called the negative confession. And we know that this goes back to at least the beginning of the 18th dynasty. So a little bit prior to the Exodus, it would have been even before Moses was born, that they started using this. The papyrus that I show in the book is from Hugh Nefer, and this one's from about 1300 BC. But like I said, this process was known. So within this process, they had a ceremony that is often called the weighing of the heart. So they would show these two scales. They thought that the deceased would go after dying to this judgment period, and there would be a scale. And on one side of the scale, you would have the person's heart. And on the other side, you would have the feather of truth. Well, in the Egyptian mindset, they believed that every time someone sinned, their heart got heavier and heavier with sin. And so if you had too much sin, it would outweigh the feather of truth, and then you would be denied going into paradise. And so when Moses is talking about how Pharaoh made his own heart heavy, he's telling us that Pharaoh is sinning by rejecting God and rejecting God's commands. And that it has implications and understanding for the Egyptian context too, because they could see clearly what he is saying, that this guy, he's sinning, he's not going to go to the good place in the afterlife.
You know, it was interesting when I read that in there, and I have to confess, I had never seen this before, and I was intrigued by it. I knew our audience would be. You know, I was thinking about the feather. The feather almost represents perfection. I mean, how light is a feather, right? I mean, it virtually is weightless. So you put any of your sins on the other side of the scale, you lose. So it's really fascinating. It also obviously gives us insight to the eyewitness nature of the Exodus narrative, Titus.
Yeah, it really shows how the author of Exodus was extremely familiar with Egyptian culture and religion, to the point where we could argue that he must have been living there. And of course, in this 18th dynasty time period, that's also a connection that we can see.
Yeah, I think I know a guy who lived in Egypt and might have written the Bible. His name is Moses. And, we know a lot of many scholars, most scholars reject that notion, but here we have the biblical testimony and evidence of an eyewitness account, someone who was there. It's the only way to explain these kind of data points. It's remarkable.
Right. There are many things throughout the Pentateuch that really demonstrate an author who is extremely familiar with Egyptian language and culture and geography and religion.
Yeah.
So that in and of itself is a powerful argument.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we see in Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7, affirming that he was raised in the court and knew all this stuff. So it makes total sense. Now we're going to shift a little bit. We're going to move ahead further now because your book is organized chronologically. So let's go to the story about David and Goliath. And I'll let you pick up a discovery related to Goliath in particular.
Yeah, this is sometimes called the Gath ostracon or the Goliath ostracon because of its connection there. So an ostracon is simply a piece of pottery, like a broken piece of pottery, usually flat or somewhat flat, that people would use to write on, sort of like a scratch paper or a durable letter that you're reusing, you're recycling. And the name for this comes from Greek and comes from the process of ostracizing someone from the city-state. So back in classical Greek, they started this practice where people could vote on who they would basically kick out of the city in exile for a period of time by writing their name on a piece of pottery and dropping it off, and then they would tally those up. So that's where we get the term for it. But this Goliath ostracon or Gath ostracon, this was found in Gath, thus the name. Okay, so Gath is the city that Goliath is associated with, and it dates to the 10th century BC or the 9th century BC. So it's also about the same time as Goliath. But what's written on here is very interesting because we have two names, and one of these names, linguists would say, is etymologically similar to or equivalent to Goliath, right? So it's not written in Hebrew, so we're not going to see the exact same letters, but they're saying that this is the name Goliath rendered differently. And so we have the name Goliath in Gath from maybe around the 10th century. That at least tells us that his name, which is pretty unique, it's not something you're going to find Canaan and Israel and so forth, is there, present in the right city at the right time.
Yeah, it could have been found anywhere. Maybe somebody, living in Israel would have known the story, but we find it in one of the Philistine cities and the one that Goliath came from.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm not going to draw the conclusion that it has to be talking about Goliath in the David story, but again, right. It demonstrates the historical context is correct there in that time of David, in the place Gath with the name Goliath.
Yeah, I think that's a good conclusion and a little wink there. It's tempting to go all the way with the argument, but it does speak into that. And again, it's another piece of evidence that fits the right place and the right time. And now we're going to fast forward like 1,000 years here, but we want to get into some New Testament discoveries. And so we encourage people to pick up a copy of your book and to fill in the gaps in between the time. Let's talk about, you have 26 discoveries in the book about the New Testament, I should say. So we picked just a handful here to discuss. Let's talk about this discovery in Rome called the Jesus graffiti, and I'll let you explain what that is.
So this was discovered on the Palatine Hill. That's the area where the emperors typically had their royal palace. And it dates to between about 90 and 200 BC and AD, and that's because of the building in which it was found. That was constructed about 90, and it was burned in a fire around 200. So it's a bit of a range, but that comes from end of the 1st century all the way through the 2nd century. It's still quite early for artifacts associated with Christianity, but this is a carving essentially into a wall. It's graffiti where some Roman polytheists or pagans are mocking and making fun of Christ and of a particular Christian whose name they write on this graffiti. So it's a piece of artwork that shows a cross. It shows somebody on the cross. It shows this person, Jesus, actually with a donkey head because they're trying to mock him. And then it shows a person, a Christian, and he is looking up to the cross, and they have written Alexamenos, that's the name of the guy, of the Christian guy. It says Alexamenos worships his God. So they're making fun of him because they're thinking, look, what is this guy doing? He's worshiping a God that got crucified. How ridiculous is that? Just as Paul said that the crucifixion was a stumbling block to those from the mind of Judaism, and he said that for the Hellenistic mindset, that it was foolishness because they just couldn't imagine how a God would be subjected to a penalty that was reserved for non-citizen who committed the worst crimes.
And not only the date range, about 100-year range, we can't be more precise than that based on the archaeological evidence, but it's all the way in Rome. And so that's consistent with the fact that the gospel had gotten all the way to Rome. And clearly, this is just a regular person here. We're not talking about like a famous person, just someone who had received the gospel and was being made fun of.
Right. It demonstrates the spread of Christianity. It demonstrates early knowledge of Christianity and of Jesus and the crucifixion. And that, again, like you said, it's just some common person. It's not anybody famous. It's not even talking about one of the apostles. It's just a local guy probably who had become a believer.
Yeah, it's a spiritual lesson to encourage us. You know, Jesus says, if the world hates you, remember it hated me first. And in this depiction, you know, you have a sort of a hatred, a mockery of Jesus. And we put up with that today as Christians in the culture and the world that we live in. Certainly our brothers and sisters who live around the world endure all kinds of mistreatment and persecution. So this reminds us to stay strong in the faith and to cling to Christ, even though there's mockery that will take place until the end of the age. So that's my little theological commentary there, Titus. But let's shift a little bit to, we're going to talk about Rome again. Let's talk about this altar to the unknown God. I was fascinated by this. I had to include this in our discussion.
All right, so I decided to include this particular artifact because it connects to the story in Acts 17 where Paul is in Athens, and he gives an example using an altar to the unknown God to talk about the God that these Greeks in Athens did not know. Now, there was an altar in Athens that was discovered, but this has been lost in time. So in Rome, there's something similar, and it's a dedication basically just to some whatever deity. They don't know who it is, what it is. They even say to a god or goddess. So they're covering their bases, which is exactly how the Greeks were doing it. So the one that I show the picture of in the book, that has a Latin inscription. Now, the one that we're talking about in Acts that Paul is using as an example, that had a Greek inscription. Okay, so they're rendering it a little bit differently, but it's a similar idea. They're trying to cover their bases. Whatever God it is that they have missed in sacrificing to or worshiping, they're going to cover it with that. Now, why is this important? So first of all, it shows that Paul was not just making up some example out of thin air, but that he actually saw an altar in Athens while he was walking around, and he said, this is a great way to segue into my message. I'm going to use that as an example. And so there have been altars written with Greek inscriptions to the unknown gods discovered. There also, supposedly in 1208, the Pope found an altar with the inscription to the unknown God in Athens. I said that one's been lost. But then ancient historians like Pausanias in the 2nd century, he talks about in Athens the altar to the unknown God. And if we keep going back in history, we see that it probably connects to what's called the Cylon affair, where there was this plague in Athens. They were trying to get rid of it. They were sacrificing and offering to every god. They couldn't. So they decided to start making altars and offerings to the unknown God, the one they were missing. So Paul's talking about a real thing. We have evidence that that thing actually existed in the ancient world, and even particularly in Athens.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You know, I was reminded once, I heard a sermon about the particular use of Paul when he's talking about how they're searching and groping to find this unknown God. And the verb there used is to describe the Cyclops from Homer that loses his eyesight. It gets his eye stabbed out. You know, it's sort of like a blind groping in the dark. And they're sort of covering their bases. You know, well, we haven't gotten all these, so let's get this other one over here, just like you said. Now, Titus, we're going to talk about one of my favorite discoveries, the Nazareth inscription. And I would like you to tell the story about the Nazareth inscription, why you included it in your book, and what you know about it.
Well, the Nazareth inscription got that name because supposedly it appeared in Nazareth. It was actually taken to Paris eventually, but when the collector died, he had a note on this work, said that it was acquired from Nazareth, and it come in 1878. But this is a big piece of marble, a marble slab that has an extensive inscription carved into it in Greek, 22 lines. And this is an edict of the emperor. So what happened is the emperor would have sent a letter to the province, and he would have prescribed this new law and given some details, and then they would have carved that new edict into stone, set it up somewhere in public so people could read it, and then they were updated on the latest law. Now, why does this have anything to do with the New Testament or with the Gospels and Jesus? When this was first discovered and they translated it and scholars began to study it, really they immediately noticed that there was a connection, it seemed, to Jesus and the resurrection story, because this edict prescribes a new penalty, the death penalty, capital punishment, for anyone who breaks into a stone-sealed sepulcher tomb and takes out the body with what it calls wicked intent. So it's a similar type of tomb, or the same type of tomb that Jesus is buried in, one of these sepulcher tombs that's sealed with a big stone. The body is in there, okay, it hasn't been cremated like was common in the Roman world. And they take the body out. They don't actually rob the tomb of tomb treasures and goods, but they take the body out, and there's some intent behind removing the body. But they actually don't get into that. So this recalled for scholars what was going on in Matthew 28 when the Roman soldiers were paid to say that the disciples came and stole the body of Jesus so that they could then spread the resurrection story.
Yeah, that's a great summary. So these tombs that it describes are very particular the way that it's in the inscription, if I understand it correctly. Sepulcher sealing tombs. Now, that was not a type of tomb throughout the Roman Empire. Am I correct about that?
Right. So the Romans typically buried their dead in cemeteries, and they often cremated bodies and used burial urns. So this is something that is much more common in the context of Judea and Galilee, just like we read in the Gospels, where they had these stone-cut tombs, and then they would seal them up. And of course, first of all, they put the body in there on a bench, and then about a year later, they'd collect the bones and put them in the ossuary. So there is a distinction between the typical types of tombs used by Jews, used by Romans.
So, and the wicked intent would probably be the preaching of the resurrection. You stole the body, and now you're pretending that this guy, Jesus, was raised from the dead. That's your intention, to deceive people. Now, there's been a recent study that tries to sort of debunk this connection that we're talking about. Maybe you could give a quick survey of what the study is and why they, and what they say about the Nazareth inscription.
So this study was started with the intent of trying to figure out exactly where the Nazareth inscription originated. Because as I said earlier, it had been acquired and turned up in Paris. It was bought on the antiquities market, as far as we can tell, and supposedly originated in Nazareth. But since it wasn't from an actual archaeological excavation, we don't have what's called the provenance for that. We don't know exactly where it originated in ancient times. So they took a small sample of the marble, and it underwent chemical analysis, and then they compared this to the chemical analysis done on marble from many different quarries that were used in ancient times. And the one that they got a very close match for was a quarry that was used during the Roman period on the island of Kos. So the island of Kos is just off of the western coast of Turkey today. Actually pretty close to where the mausoleum of Halicarnassus is located.
Okay.
So then the conclusion was of this study that this inscription actually had nothing to do with Nazareth or Jesus, that it was put in Kos and it connected to something that happened in Kos. And they said that this has to do with a person called Nicias of Kos, who was a tyrant of the island and died around 30 BC. And they were saying that Augustus Caesar probably issued this because the people broke into Nicias's tomb and desecrated it and his body in public after his death.
Okay, so that's sort of the skeptical reinterpretation of it. But, did they have sepulchre sealing tombs in west of Turkey, on the islands of Greece?
So this wouldn't be the typical type of Greek tomb. That's correct. It fits much better in the context of Judea. Yeah. But there are other issues. Like, first of all, just because the marble comes from a quarry on the island of Kos does not mean that that's actually where the inscription was placed and related to. In fact, basically all of the marble during the time of Jesus was imported because there just aren't local sources around there. Turkey was a major area where it was imported. And in fact, Herod the Great and Herod Agrippa both imported marble from that quarry on the island of Kos. There are inscriptions on the island that talk about Herod the Great and Herod Agrippa. So we shouldn't be surprised, actually, that the marble came from there.
Yeah.
So just because the marble source there doesn't mean the artifact is from there, relates to that. I mean, if we applied that logic broadly to the Roman Empire, then we would be throwing artifacts to all sorts of places where they didn't connect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's good pushback against this recent argument. Well, believe it or not, Titus, we've run out of time. I was going to let you talk more, but I can't. So I have to say goodbye, and I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. We want to encourage people to buy your book. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
There are, of course, a whole bunch more artifacts listed in Dr. Kennedy's book, Unearthing the Bible, so it's a pretty good resource. You can get a copy anywhere books are sold, or you can also buy it from the ABR bookstore, and that actually helps the ABR ministry out a little bit. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.